Hello, friends. Welcome back to Sorry What. Today's story is quite different from our usual stories, but I hope you'll still like it. Get comfortable with your favorite drink and let us begin. Jessica was in a room with her best friend, Abby, and her two bridesmaids, Kayla and Hailey. Jessica, a very pretty blonde with shoulder-length hair and beautiful face, sitting as a hairstylist, finished her hair. She was physically similar to her mother, except her mother was a supermodel gorgeous blonde, even in her 40s. She was visibly nervous and kept playing with her hands. Standing behind her, her best friend Abby chided her lightly. "Jess, calm down. It's going to be wonderful." Jessica nodded. "I know. I wish my mom was going to be here. Even after everything, I wish she could see my wedding." Abby, a striking brunette with shoulder-length hair and equally pretty face, shrugged. "I'm sorry it didn't work out." She always was kind of an elitist snob. She winced at the harshness of her words. "Sorry, that came out wrong." Jessica sighed, then nodded slightly in agreement. "But it's accurate. Yet she married my father and he wasn't from old money like her family." Abby nodded, but both her father's parents were professionals, and he was a Wall Streeter on his way up when they met. Jessica said, "But Austin is on his way up." Abby shook her head, "But he started from a trailer in coal country, and an engineer is not a Wall Streeter as far as money is concerned. All our mom can see is that he grew up in that trailer." Jessica sighed. "I don't care that he won't make Wall Street money. I don't like the people on Wall Street, anyway. I just wish she could see what I see in Austin." Abby giggled. "Yeah, I saw it when we went skinny dipping in Rolf's sanatorium late one night." Jessica faux chastised her friend, "Abby, that pens belongs to me. It's attached to Austin and he's mine." Abby waggled her finger. "You were looking at Michael's equipment as much as I was looking at Austin's. Relax. I did not touch. And I won't. Ever." Jessica stuck her tongue out and said with faux indignation, "Keep away from my man." Abby gave a faux grimace, offering tongue. "Only my hubby, Michael, gets to use his tongue on me." Jessica laughed. "Which?" Abby laughed, back at you. "Which?" They hugged and Jessica they both laughed, besties forever. There was a tap at the door. "Jess. It's Dad. May I come in?" Jessica's frown disappeared, brightening into a smile. "Yes, Daddy, come in." The door opened and Mark Windsor, her father, walked in. He was a striking man in his mid-40s, around 6 foot tall, with salt and pepper hair and a C-suite air about him. His perfect navy blue tailored suit and red tie gave him the classic handsome air. He came in smiling, taking in the view of his daughter in her wedding dress, then hugging her. "I can't believe today is the day. My baby daughter is getting married." Jessica smiled. "Daddy, I will always be your baby daughter." He sighed. "Sorry your mom won't be here. I made sure some of her friends, the few that would even talk to me, let her know she was invited, and I would not do anything to ruin the day. I even said she could bring a +1. Jessica sighed, then said with more than a bit of annoyance, "If she cannot deal with reality, then she can stay away." He nodded. "Still, I wish she could be here for you, even if just for the wedding portion." Jessica sighed and her face softened. "Yeah, me too." There was another tap at the door. A man in a pastor's collar came up. 10 minutes. 7 minutes later, her father held out his arm and asked, "Ready?" Jessica smiled, now beaming. "Yes." Jessica walked to the aisle from the right side, and Mark gave her arm a squeeze, and gestured to the right side of the rear row. She paused, smiled, then patted his arm. He then walked her slowly up the aisle of the church, her hand in his arm until they reached her intended, and she took her place at the altar. Mark then walked up to stand next to the groom. The pastor played his part, "Dearly beloved." 5 hours later, after the wedding and the ceremony and the dinner, Mark was called up by the MC they hired, who also was the DJ, and now, the best man will make his speech. Jessica's father stood and smiled at the guests. "Life is funny sometimes. I have apologized to Austin 100 times personally, and I am probably short of the number of times he is due until I reach 1,000. Let me say it loud and in front of everyone. I was wrong. I judged Austin on things that do not matter and lived in my own Wall Street finance world, never considering the worth of a man is much more. I let things happen. I should have stopped when I had even the slightest hint. I see a young man who overcame being born to humble circumstances in eastern Kentucky. I wasn't born at third base, but I was born at second base to a production manager and a CPA. Austin was born in the batter's box and he was facing a major league pitcher. He had to make it all the way to get where he is now after beating that pitcher, a graduate of Notre Dame with an engineering degree." He looked at Austin and nodded in respect. "He is a better man than me in many ways. The first time I apologized to him, he put me further in his debt by simply accepting it without condition or demanding further contrition on my part. I fell further in his debt the next day when he formally asked my daughter's hand in marriage, then asked me to be the best man. I can never make up that much ground, no matter how hard I try. I have told him this and he has told me repeatedly that he calls us heathen and not to try. I am honored that my daughter has found such a man to share her life. Here I am, the best man at my daughter's wedding. I was honored to walk her down the aisle, and then walk to the front of the church to stand beside the amazing man she was to marry. She earned her CPA in 4 years, and has proved she could work every bit as hard as those of average stations in life, choosing to prove her worth to the world rather than rest on privilege. Mark smiled and yes, was missing up quite a bit when he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you, Mr. and Mrs. Austin and Jessica Branson." He toasted them both, then sat back down. There were the standard dances as the music played when Mark's cousin, Richard, came up to him sitting at a table and asked, "That was one hell of a speech. What the hell happened? I mean the whole story. Her mother wasn't at the wedding. You're divorced. A year ago, shit, I could never imagine this. That and your apology to Austin." Mark sighed, "Well, it's a long story. And actually her mother was and still is here. She's over in the corner hiding, letting her pride keep her from enjoying her own daughter's wedding day. I quietly let Jessica know that when she started walking down the aisle and I spotted Andrea in the back row." Richard shook his head and then said, "Give me the short version." Mark nodded. "Do you know what a coy wolf is?" Richard shook his head. "Some kind of wolf." Mark nodded. "Kind of. In the Eastern US, wolves were hunted out for the most part, but a coy wolf is about 60% coyote and 40% wolf. Sometimes a bit of dog is mixed in. They are much bigger than coyotes. Many are around 30 to 40 pounds, but big ones with more wolf can get into the 60-pound range. They are considerably smaller than a full-blood wolf, but not exactly small. A 60-pound male made me see the error of my ways and started a big fight with my ex, and it went south from there." Richard nodded. "So?" Mark sipped his bourbon and continued, "Well, we first heard about Austin during spring break during her junior year in college at Notre Dame. My ex invited Jessica down to Palm Beach for a mother-daughter week. Jessica politely refused, and when her mother pressed her, she found out Jessica had been dating Austin since the previous September. I got an earful of nasty indignation that some hellbilly was dating our daughter. She called him that and worse. Anyway, Jessica informed her mom that they were headed to the Bahamas for spring break together, and yes, they were sharing a room." Richard nodded. "Ah. It's hard to find out your daughter was being intimate with someone." Mark shrugged. "Not really. People pair up and duck. My daughter is an adult and I'm not stupid. She had sex with her ex, Chet Backley, while they were together and I knew. Again, people pair up and duck and it's a human thing. I was the same with me and Andrea when we were dating. We had sex hundreds of times before we got married." Richard nodded. "Yesh, my daughter and her boyfriend. Not subtle." Mark laughed. "Congratulations, your daughter is completely normal. Having sex is good for you, by the way. Your wife is back at your table making eyes at you, by the way. A dance or 3 and you will probably get lucky." Richard smiled and they clinked glasses. Mark continued, "Well, it turns out Andrea had invited Chet to Palm Beach, in hopes that Jessica and Chet would get back together." Richard shook his head with a look of disdain and said, "Chet is a pompous asshole like his father." Mark laughed. "The only insult there is to garden variety assholes." Richard laughed and they clinked glasses again. Mark continued, "So Andrea's plan to get them back together was a bust, and the school year went on. Well, Jessica was due to come home that summer, then announced she would be 2 weeks late coming home. She and Austin were driving around the country in his car seeing the sights along the East Coast." Richard laughed. "The daughter of a billionaire being driven around the East Coast for a vacation instead of Connor St. Moritz." Mark laughed. "In a 20-year-old Honda Accord no less. She loved it and raved for weeks." They laughed and clinked glasses again. Mark said, "I was fine with it, well, mostly. I wanted her to marry a man of her station, but was content to let things fall where they may. Yeah, I was a bit of a snob, but I had him investigated and found him to be a solid person with no legal concerns. He was salutatorian for his high school class, and had a half-scholarship ride for Notre Dame." Richard thought for a second then said, "Let me guess, Andrea had other ideas." Mark nodded, and she gave me an earful. "Austin is not good enough and Chet is old money. Austin was a hellbilly after our money. Blah blah. Our daughter needed to be part of the summer parties at the Hamptons, and the whole elite world of money bullshit. She told me directly that Austin was not good enough. Chet is perfect for her with the proper social connections." Richard laughed. "Let me guess further. Jessica was having none of it." Mark laughed. "You think? She was and still is madly in love with Austin. You can see it in her eyes the way she lights up when he comes into the room. Well, Austin wanted time with his mom that summer, and Jessica wanted time with us and her local friends, so each went home for the rest of the summer before their senior year." Richard nodded, so Andrea was not okay with things. Mark shook his head, not even close. She kept inviting Chet over. Jessica was polite at first, but got tired of Chet showing up and acting like they were together. Andrea invited Chet to fancy dinners at fancy restaurants with Jessica, trying to get them back together. She invited them to spend time together in Interlachen with her money. Jessica was wise to her plans pretty early, and just kept putting her off. Richard sighed, so what the hell happened to cause your divorce? Mark sighed, a party. A big fancy party full of rich people at Sterling Pines, our country club in New Jersey. Andrea pretended to accept Austin and wanted a party at our country club, and invited Austin to come up and for him to meet our friends. Our friends was a lie. It was her old money friends who tolerated me. Richard shook his head, okay. Mark said, well, to my shame, I wasn't exactly objecting to all the machinations of my ex. I knew something was up, but said nothing and did nothing to look into it. That is on me. It turns out the idea was to have a big party with all sorts of elites and other old money, and Austin would be a fish out of water and humiliated by not fitting in. Richard nodded, and Mark said, so here we are at the country club, 100 or so millionaires and more than a few billionaires, all very rich, and here is Austin, a kid whose mom was living in a trailer in eastern Kentucky. Richard asked, what happened to his dad? Mark said, dead. Coal mine accident. Richard said, to add insult to injury, my ex secretly invited Chet. Richard shook his head, oh. Mark laughed, not for very long. So here I am not saying a damn thing while my ex is trying to get Jessica to dance with Chet in front of Austin, and constantly reminding him that Chet had been her previous lover. Richard winced, yeah, that is not awkward. Mark said, it was embarrassing. It was obvious what she was trying to do and even some of her friends were aghast at it. The thing is, Jessica made it dead clear that she was with Austin the whole time, and refused to do anything with Chet but polite conversation, and not anywhere private. Mark sighed, that was the beginning of the final end for Andrea and I, and it went straight downhill from there. Scratch that. That was when I started to figure out that my entire life with her was bullshit. My wife went over to a table with caviar and called Austin over and explained it in this awful condescending manner, then started teaching Austin how to eat caviar, as if you needed a lesson, and as if everyone wants to eat fish eggs. While she is giving this fake lesson, trying her best to humiliate Austin, then having Chet demonstrate this fake stupid skill. Mark sighed. At this point, I grabbed Andrea by the wrist, and hauled her to the side, and told her to cut it the duck out. He shuddered, I saw it then. Just evil. Andrea's face twisted into a snarl. Just evil. She told me that Austin was not good enough, and Chet was. She would do anything to prevent Austin from staying with Jessica, even hire an escort to seduce Austin if needed. That one shocked me. Andrea was willing to break the law to break Austin and Jessica up. If Chet was not Jessica's choice, she would find someone else, of the proper station in life. Richard sighed, wow. Mark nodded, wow is right. Well, Andrea pulled her hand away from me and stalked off to find Chet when fate intervened. I was on the far side of the clubhouse pool. Andrea was walking toward Chet. Andrea went up to Chet and whispered in his ear, then Chet started walking toward Jessica and Austin. Fate intervened, and Fate was a 60-pound coy wolf. Richard said, an actual coy wolf. Mark nodded, 60 pounds of growling angry coy wolf. They are usually fairly shy, but not this one. Well, we all heard the coy wolf growl and we all looked up and froze. The coy wolf was closest to Jessica, and second closest was Chet as he approached her. From that side, Austin was the third closest but kind of behind her in relation to the coy wolf. Well, two things happened at once. Chet stopped on a dime and damn near ran backward away. Austin grabbed Jessica and spun her behind himself, then stared at the coy wolf which advanced on them. It seemed more interested in Jessica, but Austin kept himself between the coy wolf and Jessica. There was no thinking, he just acted. Austin was protecting his mate. Period, end of story. As it moved, he moved, protecting my little girl and putting himself in harm's way. Richard said, no shit. Mark nodded, yep. A security guy arrived maybe 30 seconds later and shot the coy wolf. Needless to say, pretty much everyone at the party suddenly loved Austin, myself included. 22 years ago, I held this tiny baby girl, and wished she would find a man who would put her first. Austin proved to be that man in very concrete terms. Richard chuckled, except for your ex and Chet. Mark laughed, I haven't seen Chet since. Andrea started fighting me hard. I finally remembered I had balls and needed to use them. I made sure Chet did not show up again, and kept close tabs on Andrea until the party ended. She was on her phone quite a bit, but looked very angry. I think she was calling Chet, but I'm not dead sure of it. Mark sighed, the rest of the party sucked as I was now on guard against any other sheep from Andrea. Everyone was patting Austin on the back, telling him he was a badass. He had billionaire Wall Streeters paying him compliments, and Jessica was looking at him like he was a superhero. Around 8 that night, the party broke up and we went home. We started fighting on the way home and it was brutal. It was bad, very very bad. She kept going on and ducking on. Austin was poor. Austin was a hellboy. Austin was not from the right family. Austin was this or that or other bad thing. I reminded her I was not from an elite family. She said that I needed to man up and get rid of Austin because I was letting some hellboy loser seduce our daughter. Mark rolled his eyes and took a sip of his bourbon, then it got worse when we got home. With what was basically a demonic smile that was more grimace than anything, she told me that I wasn't good enough for her when we met, but she saw my potential to be good enough, and she worked on me to make me acceptable. Richard winced, which? Mark shook it off and said tensely, yeah. The love goggles were gone completely then, and I saw her for the selfish person she was. She sneered and talked about how I was her personal lifetime project. My success was only due to her, even though my results at work were consistently in the top 10%. We went home and slept on opposite sides of the bed, facing away from each other. Mark sighed and calmed slightly. That was the night I almost lost my daughter. She was spending the night in a hotel with Austin and called me the next morning. She asked me to meet her at Vanderbilt Park at the bandstand. So I drove into New Jersey and met her in Summit at Vanderbilt Park. I realized what an asshole I was. What I did not realize was that was when Jessica figured out what an asshole I was. Richard asked, what happened at the park? Mark laughed. I accidentally changed her plans. She was going to tell us both that she did not want to see us for a while. She was livid and was even considering cutting us off completely. Richard looked shocked. Wow. Mark sighed. Well, I got out of my car and saw them by the bandstand, so I walked toward them, and Jessica's face held no love for me. She asked with quite a bit of hostility, where is Mom? When I said I wanted to meet you here, I meant both of you. I told her that her mom and I had a huge fight, then I quite accidentally saved my relationship with Jessica. I felt like a piece of sheep, and without her asking I looked at Austin and apologized. I gave them the high-level view of what happened, and apologized for not putting an end to it right from the start. Mark chuckled to himself. Then Austin proved how much better he is than me. He stuck his hand out to shake and said, okay. I did nothing to stop her mother from trying to kill their relationship until the end. I apologized and he accepted it. He just accepted the apology. I told him I had no excuse and should have put a stop to everything early on. He shrugged and told me he understood, and happy wife, happy life. Mark took another sip. I quipped, angry wife, awful life. He laughed and then told me my wife would come around. We went to IHOP of all places, had breakfast, and he talked to me with no animosity. He had truly forgiven me. Sheep. He was looking for a way to forgive my wife, and hoped she would come around. Richard chuckled slightly. That will happen the first of never. Mark nodded. So I got home, and Andrea was in the witch mood of witch moods. She started screaming at me, asking where I had been. I told her that I had gone into New Jersey to apologize to our daughter and Austin for my atrocious behavior. Well, Andrea lost it and went on about how Austin was below Jessica's station. Blah blah leadus snubbery blah. She stalked off telling me she had work to do. I got a call an hour later. It was Austin asking to meet in Summit again. It was a called civil war at the house, and Summit is a pretty town, so I headed back over the bridge to Summit. I was expecting them both, but only Austin was at the park then. Turns out Jessica was shopping with Abby at Short Hills Mall. I started with my apology again, and he repeated that it was water under the bridge. Then he shocked the sheep out of me when he brought out a ring box and asked permission to propose to Jessica. I assured him that I was in no position to withhold blessing, and any debt between us was for me to him. He repeated that he did not need any further apologies, and simply asked for my blessing, and of course, I gave it to him. He again shocked every living sheep out of me again, and told me to be at Summerlee's Steakhouse the following night and to be hidden, but I was welcome to witness his proposal that night. Mark sighed and shook his head. I am so unworthy of having someone like him as a son-in-law. Richard laughed. But your daughter is worthy of having a man like that. Mark smiled, nodded, and they clinked glasses. Mark continued, so. I went home, debating saying anything to Andrea about the engagement. I came home to an empty house, and actually, it was a bit of relief. An hour later, Andrea came home with this guy from Muncie in Rockland County. I'm looking at this clear setup. Andrea has this, I don't know, just a nasty smile on her face. She looks at me and tells me to meet Alexander Benedict. I shrugged. Then she told me straight up that she was tired of me not supporting her in her quest to get rid of Austin, and that her trip the following week was not to see her sister. It had been a lie, and she was heading to con with Alexander. She had no more need of hiding anything from me or interfering with her love life. Richard winced. It's like, Mark shuddered. Some kind of weird internet story written by a lunatic on a website. Richard chuckled. Lunatic is right. Mark shrugged. The odd thing was, I was okay with it. You would expect angry, but I wasn't. I did not care. I just didn't. I shrugged and told her to stay an extra month if she wanted to. I was fine with it. It was just a relief. I told her we were divorcing. She raged at me, promising all kinds of penury in my future. She bragged about how she had been slutting around on me for years in the northern suburbs around Rockland County, away from our home on Long Island, and lived 2 separate lives. He had a 50-foot-long clock. He could make her come just by looking at her. He was a stud and I am a dud. Mark laughed. She said a whole bunch of cliches all at once. Mark shrugged. At her family's insistence we had a prenup. It was a bit one-sided as far as her family wealth stayed with her. I already had a rough idea of what the asset split would look like. I decided to not tell Andrea about the upcoming proposal because she would surely ruin it. I held my tongue on telling Jessica what her mom was doing for several days, again to not ruin her proposal night. I went to Summerlee's and it was all set up. I was in a corner booth with a woman they had hired to be a photographer. They came in and sat down for dinner. 5 minutes later, he did the one knee thing in front of the whole place. Jessica said yes, then buried him in kisses telling him she was the happiest woman in the world. Her best friend, Abby, and her husband, Michael were there at another out-of-the-way table. I was there and we all got to see it. Sheep. I paid for everyone's dinner, even the people who were just strangers who had witnessed the proposal. I'm glad Jessica did not ask about her mom that night, so she got to go back to her hotel room with Austin happy. I got home and Andrea was nowhere to be found. She was probably screwing her lover and I did not care. I slept happy, partly because of Jessica's successful engagement, and partly because I knew I would be free. Richard asked, so her mom did not know about the engagement? Mark shook his head. Nope, not at first, and I just did not care. She could find her own sources. I was just done with it all. She came back to the house early the next morning and of course, told me how clever she was having lovers in the northern suburbs instead of Long Island. I told her to lawyer up and we were done. She started screeching evil threats, and boy did she deliver. I went into work. The next day was Monday, and I found a security guard waiting for me with several boxes of my stuff. The president came out and told me that I was no longer employed there. From high level of a Wall Streeter to unemployed in a week. She had called her father to call in all of his favors on Wall Street. Andrea was the awful acorn that fell from her awful oak tree of a father. Mark laughed. Richard was shocked. Why are you laughing? Mark said, she had gone to all this trouble to try to burn down my life, and the only thing I felt was that I was free. Suddenly, I was happy in a way I never could understand. Suddenly this weight of a loveless marriage and a stressful life was gone. They had gone to all this trouble, even getting a restraining order against me coming to my home or my former employer. I made plans to fly to England and do something I had always wanted to do, walk the southwest coast path, and I made reservations for over 3 weeks of it. Andrea would never have wanted to do something like hiking a scenic 600-mile-long footpath. I was free. I had to get everything situated, so I made the plans for 2 weeks in the future. Richard asked, you went alone? Mark nodded. Alone. It was magical. The Bristol Channel to my right, English countryside to my left. It was cathartic as hell. I met a lot of nice people, had a lot of nice meals, all alone. I saw magical seaside villages and magical towns like St. Ives. The weight of my former life fell from me, and I felt reborn. Back to Jessica. I called Jessica and met them in Summit on Tuesday, and gave them the high-level information of what had happened regarding Andrea's lover and our upcoming divorce. Jessica was shocked and royally pissed at her mom even more. I warned them that my soon-to-be ex was planning on hiring an escort to try to seduce Austin. That made Jessica even madder. I told them I was taking off in a couple weeks to do my trip. Mark leaned back smiling. I was free. I was still ridiculously rich and I was free. The last place I wanted to go was anywhere near Andrea. Richard chuckled. All it cost you was $1 billion. Mark laughed. Worth every penny and I still have $1 billion. I will be quite fine unless I go full stupid with my money. My current life is perfect, and Andrea has already been through 3 boy toys from what I have heard. He sipped again and laughed. Duck, I don't care. She will find out what happens when her looks fade away completely. I don't think she is capable of true love the more I think about it. Alone is a life sentence that awaits her. That, and of course, cats. Lots of cats are in her future. Richard laughed and toasted to cats in Andrea's future. The clink glasses. Mark laughed. I heard loverboy Alexander was also banging Lydia Farnsworth, his boss's married daughter, and they got caught. Lots of fun fireworks on that divorce, and he got his stupid peach fired for it. No one on Wall Street is willing to go against old man Farnsworth and hire good old Alex. Who knows what else Farnsworth has planned for Alex's future. I am glad I am not due his wrath. Mark laughed again, then rolled his eyes to vengeful fathers. To clink glasses. Mark sipped then said, so after being booted out of my home and my job, I rented the tower suite in the plaza, so I could get everything done that needed me to be in person. I moved a bunch of money around. Not to hide it, but to make sure none of it was where Andrea's family could pull strings to make life difficult. That took until Friday morning, and by then, I had everything on autopilot through my lawyer, and he got the restraining orders rescinded. Austin and Jessica invited me down to Kentucky to meet his family, and that is when I met his mom and cousins. I went to this barbecue and it was just amazingly enjoyable. Mark smiled at the memories, there entered the Fireman's Park on the edge of downtown Pikeville. It was a blast. I had 2 burgers, ate a bunch, and drank even more. I woke up in the middle of the park at 3 in the morning when the sheriff woke me up and told me to get moving. He was not a dick about it, and even called me an Uber to my hotel. Mark smiled. A week later, I sent the sheriff 10 grand for his department rec fund, for not being an asshole when he could have run me in. He had told me that starting polite was the best way, and I presented him with no threat, so he just sent me on my way. He had no ducking idea who I was, and that I had so much wealth. I was just a guy who had too much to drink at an engagement party and wasn't making a fuss, so he just wanted to keep everything peaceful. Pretty place, all the hills and trees. It was in a town named Pikeville, which is doing better than most of the rest of the area. I even enjoyed an evening in town with Austin at a place called Judy's Jugs, where I got to sample more than a few quarter shots of different makers of local moonshine. Turns out craft liquor is quite an industry down there. A couple weeks later, I was in England walking along one of the nicest long-distance trails on the planet. Richard asked, it's been over a year since that happened. So now that they have graduated and married, where are you off to? Mark smiled, North Carolina. There is nothing here for me, and my daughter can visit New York City if her mother ever gets her head out of her peach and apologizes. I bought a place on Lake Norman, north of Charlotte. Bought a 24-foot speedboat for my dock. Richard smiled, sounds like you landed on your feet. Mark smiled, damn right I did. Richard asked, not playing on Wall Street? Mark shook his head, duck Wall Street. Andrea can keep her world, then shove it up her peach. I bought a small industrial building. We're going to manufacture custom patio furniture. Plenty of local demand along Lake Norman. Nothing too big, just a reason to get up and go to work each morning. Austin is going to be the ops manager and designer, and I will run the business end. Jessica will run the financial end of things with her CPA degree. Mark had a big broad smile, then leaned back and smiled, life is good. They clinked glasses and he took another sip. Richard nodded, divorced over your daughter's future husband. Richard shrugged, speaking of difference. Where is your crazy girlfriend? Mark shrugged, she is probably talking to someone. She is an expert at talking your ear off. Richard asked, worth it? Mark nodded, hell yeah. Almost a year in, I love Samantha. I never thought it could even happen again. I swore off women, but that sure did not last. Damn, I love her, and in a way I never understood until it happened. I never knew what true unselfish love was until I met her. And the sex. Damn, I never had any idea what it could be like to have a woman give herself wholly to me. Andrea needed 20 minutes to warm up and was rarely in the mood, probably because she was getting some from several lovers. Samantha needs an I love you, a gentle fondle, and a bit of making out. A minute later, she is begging me to enter her and telling me I am the best lover in the world. I know that is complete bullshit, but she makes it a point to build me up every time we are together. Hell, a minute after that, she is wet enough and begging me for more. Getting Andrea going was a complicated sequence. Samantha has an on button she pretty much lets me press whenever I'm in the mood. Samantha is the best girlfriend. Sweet, smart, loving, warm, all a man needs. A voice behind them spoke with full concern, are you talking about us? Mark turned and smiled at a woman who was pleasant to look at, but not in his ex-wife Andrea's model beautiful league. She was in her early 40s with a pleasant face and mid-back length dark brown hair. There were 2 exceptions to her moderate attractiveness. Her eyes sparkled in happiness and mirth, and her smile was comfortable and warming, like wearing a fresh warm shirt out of the clothes dryer on a cold winter day. He smiled broadly and said, damn right woman. Samantha had heard that last bit of the conversation, but was not only not offended, she closed the distance, opened her mouth and kissed him, I love you. Want to use my on button later? Mark smiled, I love you, too. Oh yeah, but maybe we should cool it during the reception. Samantha smirked, so you wouldn't like it if, I dunno, let the top of my dress fall down and flashed my melons. Mark laughed, you wouldn't do that. Samantha laughed, only because it is my son's wedding. That's it for today, friends. If you enjoyed today's story, leave a like and comment before you leave. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss any video. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video.